It's House of X number 5. There's only 4 issues left, and this issue is marked red, meaning it's a big one. So, was it? Let's talk about that. Hey there, this is Perch. This is a review for House of X number 5, and this is the only 4 left. And this issue was marked red in the kind of order of reading that the order of reading, the reading order, which the last time this happened was a reveal that Moira was a mutant and had been reincarnated over and over again. And so that was a pretty major change to the whole mythology. Does this issue have the same level of major change? Well, no, not at the same type as Moira, but it is extremely impactful to kind of the whole story, and it's a reveal that I think a lot of people saw coming, which is probably why it is a little bit less impactful. But the what this means, if what we're about to see in this issue sticks for other timelines, and I think there's a lot of reasons to believe, once again, this isn't the current X-Men timeline that we're talking about, then that will be a big deal for X-Men fans. So I'm going to try and do something a little different in this review real quick to this issue. I'm going to try and say at least some of it for people who are kind of new to the X-Men mythology and maybe confused by some of the things that are being said. I think if you're coming into the House of X, Powers of X now, kind of midway through it, then there's no hope for you. You do have to go back to issue 1. If you're coming in midstream, that makes no sense. You've got to go back. But there's been some comments. It's been interesting to see the detractors coming into this series of people who are, and it feels like a little kind of sneaky network from outside. You're seeing some kind of barbed comments being made on places like Bleeding Cool and other sites where it feels definitely like some jealous writers are kind of feeding the news site with some throwing some shade on this series. One of the current kind of narrative that keeps going around is it's way too dense. This will not attract new readers. It's definitely not accessible. That's kind of the word. This issue, while it may be fine writing, it's not accessible. I think it's plenty accessible. The interesting thing about Hickman's run here is that you certainly get value if you know these characters and know their history. It definitely helps the reading experience. But if you're coming in fresh, you kind of are given enough to work with what you have. It may be confusing, but it's not confusing because you didn't read 100 X-Men issues before it. So we getting into this issue where this is. I'll throw out one other piece of distractor. People have complained about this issue from a different direction, as some of the other YouTube people, and some of the people on social media have said. There's not enough action. Where's the old Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld? We get a couple panels of talking, but then we get to the fighting. There's not enough fighting. It's just talk, 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 talk. It bores me. Blah blah blah. Words. Oh my God, words. I don't know what to say to those people. If you want kind of very shallow, one-dimensional comics where people just kind of fight each other mindlessly, I mean, there's some out there, but just go, whatever. This comic will make you think, and this is a very intellectual part of the series. So, that much said, let's get right into it. So, we start off on Krakoa. This is picking up from the previous kind of House of X events where there was a mission that basically all the X-Men who went on it were slaughtered. And we see that they're getting ready to do something big in Krakoa. And here is Polaris and Magneto having a good conversation back and forth between kind of the relationships of mutants and humans. Again, it really fits kind of the evolution of Magneto and Polaris and her comments. And then in come some characters. And right off the bat, you're surprised to see some of these people, in particular Gold Balls, who some of these characters are creating the Bendis run as a complete and absolute joke. They were just kind of very one-dimensional characters, and they were very much in that kind of, oh gee, isn't this funny kind of mode that that a lot of the writers were doing at the time. But one of the remarkable things about what Hickman's done in this run is he's taking characters that were pretty one-dimensional, pretty shallow, and giving them depth and upping their power set. So here they come, and we're going to learn about what's going on. So the whole key to kind of mutant evolution is that we learn that gold balls, when he makes these gold balls, they're actually eggs, and life can come out from them. And then we have Proteus, who with a kind of warp of reality, the eggs become viable. and they inject DNA with a mutant. This is, I think, Hope, meant to be Hope Summers here. And then we get Elixir, who is a mutant from a couple runs back into mutants, who's able to kind of kickstart life. And then we use Eva Bell, who had some really amazing time powers, who was kind of used as a, I would say, very interesting character set up in the Bendis X-Men run, and then misused pretty poorly, of just how that character, kind of the power set came up. And by the way, some people have said I'm too hard on Bendis here. I think it's moments like this that really kind of nail home the shallowness of some of what Bendis does for characters. The guy's a good writer, and he makes good stories, and he can do plenty of good things. But when you see things like this, you see kind of the depth at which real character moments and things can go. And so here's a couple characters who are kind of just tossed aside, didn't matter, and now they're brought up in a really meaningful way. And so Hope kind of comes here, and she kind of unifies their powers based on her power set, which allows them to act in unison and make these eggs viable and bring back basically the mutants who had died, and make us whole. So out they come, naked, and Xavier comes in, and he is happy to see them. And then Polaris is going, I don't get it. Isn't there just their bodies? How do we bring their mind back? And so here's where Xavier, using kind of a new version of what Cerebro is, and he can kind of use a secondary function of the machine to take the essence, the soul, back into the shell and restore these people to life. So he brings back Cyclops, he brings back Angel, all the characters who had died, and they're resurrected. And then in comes Storm, and this is interesting. This is one of those indicators that maybe we're not seeing quite what we think we're seeing. So Storm comes out, and they're going to reintroduce these mutants who have returned to the other mutants on the island. There's this kind of big speech. She's saying, here they are. It's made possible by these mutants who have done this work. And, they're standing before you. They have returned. There's Wolverine, Nightcrawler. They're all standing out there naked. I mean, it's funny, Angel's flying up into the sky, kind of everything's flapping around, but okay. Anyway, she's saying, I see them. Do you see them? And it goes through the characters. And here, this is, I guess, a little moment, but it's funny. I was talking about this in the last week. Storm goes up to Cyclops and say, are you, the Cyclops we know? How do I know it's you, brother? And he says, you showed me what strong was, kind of referring to that X-Men 201 and kind of the bond between the two, which is pretty awesome. Just in that moment, we get Jean Grey, we get a nice little moment with Monet that fits. And so as we're going through kind of the X-Men are getting reintroduced to the world, we get an aside between Professor X and Magneto talking about, so many remain lost. This is good work. We're restoring the mutants. We're doing this. It must continue until Genosha is not spoken of as a grave, but as a crucible. The work will continue until it's done. And, Magneto says they should have killed us all when they had the chance. And there's this kind of silent moment from Professor X, which is an interesting, again, there's stuff going on here. Again, we haven't gotten the last card hasn't been revealed, and it does make you wonder who's under Professor X's mantle here. He's been always shown using this, but is there a little smile? Looks like there's a little smile there at the end, and so it makes you wonder exactly what is going on. And I think this issue, and by the way, the return and how the souls are being extracted from the body and put into new bodies of X-Men, it makes me wonder how much this ties to the previous issue of Powers of X, where we see the people separate the soul from the body to be consumed by the Techniarch Phalnax system. And there's a parallel there that I think is interesting to watch. So we go to the UN vote. This is basically getting their own nation. And, celebrating kind of the heroes of Krakoa who have come back, defeated the Sentinel Menace, and they are back. So we get a little bit about Resurrection, kind of the genetic base, how Mr. Sinister kind of plays into this, and then the host, and again, a little bit more about the powers. Cool stuff. There's an interesting piece here. It's not been tested. It's believed that upgrades and extension stand-ins could be assisted by mutants such as Sync or Mimic. The Proteus problem, because how Proteus fits into this is interesting, where the powers of the mutant are directly associated with the destruction of its own body, has been solved by always having a backup mutant husk prepared for Proteus to inhabit when he burns out his old one. So this basically means the consciousness of Proteus is just in this process moving from one to the other. It's an interesting, Proteus body normally lasts about 1 week, but can last as little as 1 day. The backup mutant husk is always created from the genetic base of Charles Xavier. So Xavier's cloning himself. This is an interesting Proteus kind of note. And I'd be really shocked if it plays out over the next 3 issues, but it makes me wonder if that's coming in the future. Um, has there been, and then another note, there's been no experimentation regarding what happens when you combine a mutant mind with a husk that is not their own, which strongly makes me feel that the Charles Xavier we're seeing here, again, is not the Xavier we think we're seeing. So anyway, resurrection capabilities, about 1,000 mutants per week, 200 a day, and we get just more about the protocol of what's going on there. Then we're back into the story, and we're getting a sequence of the United Nations. There's Emma Frost. The vote has been successful. We have a independent state, which is the mutant state, and it's who is going to abstain. There's just some interesting politics going on here. How did they change their mind? Charles Xavier knows Emma kind of influenced it, and he's not saying he accepts it, but he's saying, thank you for your sacrifice, and, off she goes but basically we see that the vote was actually manipulated a bit, and that this state, while it happened, there was some things that are going on. Then we see kind of here are the nations that didn't agree. The biggest, we have Russia, we have Latvernia, Brazil, just a handful of nations. Wakanda, they do not need mutant drugs. It's just fun. A little bit to Makanda. We see the diplomacy, the map. And then finally, 2 days later, we get a sequence between Xavier and Wolverine where it's like, we got to give all the mutants an opportunity. And in comes basically the villains, if you will. So the mutants that, here's Mr. Sinister, looking very much like Mr. Sinister, despite the people who were worried last week. We get... we just get the who's who of kind of X-Men villains coming in, and finally Apocalypse. So Apocalypse comes in. He recognizes Krakoa, and he kind of calls Krakoa to himself, and then talks about his initial battle. So this is a clue to Powers of X, where Krakoa talked to Cypher and basically explained a history that went on between Apocalypse and the island of Krakoa. So Apocalypse basically kind of gives a little speech, certainly in front of all the villains, saying, you've become what I intended you to be. I could not be more proud. We submit to the laws of the land. Be that as it may, we acknowledge this point forward. We all serve a higher purpose. From this day forward, we are one people. And let it be known, Krakoa is for all mutants. Welcome home. Charles Xavier shakes Apocalypse's hand, and a union or a bond is formed. Then... that's how the issue ends, basically, with this big moment of the villains have arrived. They're going to integrate with the other mutants, and we have this one state. So we've got 3 issues left. So what happens? Well, the belief here, I think, is that either Sinister, the villains who've been welcomed in, either blow things up. They, Sinister can't help but kind of get involved in maybe the cloning. That Professor X is not who we believe he is. Maybe he's Cassandra Nova. Maybe it's Mr. Sinister in Charles Xavier's body. We don't know. But basically, something is going on here. The belief is that this timeline we've been reading about, all these things about the mutant state and everything else, was a failure, that it did blow up, that it collapsed and dissolved, and this is the 6th timeline of Moira's life, or at least some earlier timeline. And I think there's some indication that it is the 6th timeline here, because if you go back and you look at the thread and you look at how it's come thus far, there's at least some indication that Moira was, that after this timeline, in Life 7, she basically goes and tries to destroy the Master Mold facility on her own, which may indicate that, this, in this timeline, she tried integration and she tried bringing everyone together, and it did not work. So there she died, fairly It's basically, so if this is this, sorry, I'm getting myself all tied up. If this is timeline, the missing timeline number 6, then that would indicate that she goes and she tries to do things on her own, and then she ultimately joins up with Apocalypse, which kind of features what we have now. Um, but it also suggests that what is timeline 10? Is it the life that we've been seeing all this time in the X-Men? Is it something new? I don't know. All I know is the missing timeline 6 is very suspicious. Makes me wonder if that's what we're seeing now. I think, are we seeing the unification of mutants? How does it dissolve? How does it come unglued? And what new threat are we gearing up for Dawn of X? Because it seems impossible. I think this issue really puts a nail on the head that it is what they're currently doing. What we are currently seeing is not the timeline we see in Dawn of X, or a lot of has to happen to connect those two dots in the next 3 issues, and I don't think that's possible, but we will see. A really good issue. Try not to spoil a couple things in there that are some nice surprises for you if you pick up the book. If you're new to the X-Men series, I think this is a great place to start. Sits right up there with Joss Whedon's run in terms of a starting place, or Grant Morrison, or Claremont before that. This is one of the great runs, certainly. So hope you liked it. Hope you get a chance to read it. What are your theories? Where do you think it's all going? Leave some comments below. Would love to know your thoughts. Otherwise, like, subscribe, click the bell for notification. Follow me on Twitter at Comic Perch, and thank you very much for listening.